The silence was the first thing that greeted me every morning, sharp and perfectly tuned, the kind of silence Eleanor demanded. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a restful house. It was the tense, oppressive vacuum where any natural human noise, like a laugh or a powerful note, was immediately sucked away and punished. I woke in my four-poster bed, draped in silk that felt too heavy, in a room that looked like a museum exhibit, rather than a place where a 19-year-old girl might live. Our grand New England manor, perched high above the harbor in this affluent town, was a monument to old money and impeccable taste, and I was the constant, necessary imperfection that Eleanor tirelessly sought to polish or hide. My entire existence here felt like a performance of restraint. Every morning I descended the sweeping mahogany staircase, careful to place my feet exactly on the center of the Persian rugs, avoiding the slightest creak. If I walked with too much bounce, Eleanor would call me back, her voice low and laced with surgical precision. "Sarah, a lady glides. She does not stomp like a stable hand." The house was suffocatingly elegant. Every antique, every piece of gleaming silver, every oil portrait of a stern ancestor was meant to project an image of perfection that, according to Eleanor, I constantly failed to meet. I ate breakfast in a dining room large enough to host a small wedding, the heavy sterling cutlery clinking against porcelain that was probably older than the Republic. Eleanor would sit opposite me, always impeccably dressed even at 7 in the morning, observing me with the cool, assessing gaze of a curator inspecting a flawed acquisition. Her critiques were relentless, a slow, steady erosion of my spirit. My posture was always sloppy. My choice of reading material, usually anything historical or musically technical, was unbecoming of a young woman who should be focusing on social graces. But her favorite target, the thing she attacked with the most venomous consistency, was my voice. I had been blessed, or cursed, depending on who you asked, with a voice that was naturally powerful, a true operatic soprano range that vibrated with unusual resonance. When I sang, the sound didn't just exit my throat, it filled the space, demanding attention. "Your voice, Sarah," she would sigh, placing her linen napkin down with a decisive thwack, "is entirely too much. It is uncouth. It lacks the quiet dignity expected of a woman in our circle. You must learn to contain it, to soften it. We are not performing in a circus tent." I learned early on that the only way to survive was to shrink. I spoke in careful, muted tones, consciously pulling the sound back into my chest until my voice became a fragile, reedy instrument that bore little resemblance to the powerhouse hiding within. Eleanor wanted me to be a beautifully crafted accessory, silent unless spoken to, and certainly never louder than she was. My father was the busy attorney, the source of the wealth that funded this gilded cage, but he was always distant, filtered through Eleanor's narrative. He was perpetually preoccupied, buried beneath stacks of legal briefs and the weight of his high-profile practice. I saw him through the lens of Eleanor's influence, which painted me as a problem child needing social grooming, a teenager whose wild talent was merely an embarrassing lack of discipline. I remembered trying, once, desperately, to share my music with him. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he was briefly home, sequestered in his study. I had hesitantly knocked, holding a new piece of sheet music, a soaring German lied I had been secretly practicing. "Father," I whispered, standing awkwardly in the doorway, "could I just sing this for you? It's very powerful." He looked up from his leather desk, his expression tired, not unkind, but utterly vacant. Before he could speak, Eleanor materialized silently behind me, her hand resting heavily on my shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive but felt like an anchor. "Sarah, dear," she intervened smoothly, her voice sweet and patronizing, "your father has a crucial brief due Monday. He doesn't have time for your little performances. Besides," she added, squeezing my shoulder hard enough to sting, "you know that piece is far too loud for the study. Why don't you practice your needlework?" He had simply nodded, accepting her intervention without question, already returning his gaze to his papers. Yes, Sarah. Later, perhaps. There was no later. That moment solidified the crushing realization. I was a burden he couldn't see, and Eleanor was the gatekeeper to his attention, ensuring that anything genuine about me was blocked. Now, the annual Easter service loomed. It was Eleanor's social Olympics, the pinnacle of the spring calendar, designed to solidify her standing among the church committee and impress the notoriously critical van der Waals family. This year, I had been allowed a solo, a decision that was less about recognizing my talent and more about showcasing her supposed generosity and control. But the allowance came with specific, humiliating conditions. I recalled the fitting for the dress just last week. It was a heavy, scratchy wool gown, a depressing shade of dove gray that seemed designed to absorb all light and shadow. It was shapeless, high-necked, and long-sleeved, meant specifically to hide any hint of youthful vibrancy or figure. When I protested mildly, suggesting a slightly softer fabric, Eleanor had simply smiled her cold smile. This is appropriate attire for a sacred service, Sarah. We are not performing at La Scala. We are projecting modesty and reverence. This dress ensures that the focus remains on the Lord, not on your distracting presence. It was clear she was setting me up to fail, ensuring I wouldn't overshadow her grand social triumph. The grueling coaching session was even worse. She insisted I sing the Handel aria with a modest, nearly whispered reverence. She stood over the piano, tapping her foot if I dared to add any vibrato or dynamic swell. Softer, Sarah. Think of a delicate stream, not a crashing waterfall. Drain the life from it. I want it colorless, dignified. She was demanding I commit artistic suicide. I practiced until my throat ached, forcing my powerful voice into a tight, constrained whisper, draining all life and power from the performance. I knew she was ensuring that even if I performed perfectly, the resulting sound would be weak, forgettable, and easily dismissed by the sophisticated congregation. But beneath the gray wool and the forced restraint, I held a secret, a thrilling, terrifying truth tucked away beneath the loose floorboards in the back corner of my bedroom closet. It was the acceptance letter, thick, official, and bearing the imposing seal of the U.S. Navy School of Music. I remembered the moment I received it, not through the front door, but a separate, discreet envelope mailed directly to my private post box, which I had secured months ago. The sheer joy and terror had hit me simultaneously. The Navy had seen the audition tape I submitted under an assumed name, a tape where I had finally let my voice soar, unrestricted and free. Their letter didn't talk about modesty or dignity. It talked about potential, range, and unusual power. The Navy saw the power in the voice Eleanor tried to silence. They weren't interested in a parlor maid. They were interested in a soloist capable of performing for the fleet. The knowledge was a hard, brilliant stone of hope lodged in my chest. This performance, the humiliating, whispered solo in the drab gown, was the last time I would ever sing under her oppressive, suffocating direction. Today was the day. I stood in the church vestry, the heavy, scratchy fabric of the drab dress clinging to my skin. The air smelled of old incense and polished wood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, insistent rhythm far louder than Eleanor's whispered instructions echoing in my mind. Small, quiet, modest. I looked out through the small, arched window toward the massive sanctuary. It was already filling up, packed with the elite society she revered, the pillars of the community, the judges, the van der Waals. My hands were clammy, gripping the edges of my sheet music until the paper threatened to tear. This is it, I thought, my resolve hardening like cold steel. I must sing because I am commanded to, but I will not let her break me before I am finally free. Chapter 2. The Parlor Maid and the Promise of Escape. The air in the chancel was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. I felt the heat of the spotlight intensify as I stepped onto the polished marble platform before the altar. It was a terrifyingly exposed position, elevated just enough to ensure every silk-clad parishioner in the massive sanctuary could scrutinize me. I gripped the hymnal, my knuckles white, and tried to focus on the conductor's baton. From the corner of my eye, I could see Eleanor in the front pew, nestled beside Father. She wasn't looking at me with encouragement. She was watching me like a hawk watches a mouse, ready to swoop down on the slightest deviation from her script. Her expression was one of severe, expectant judgment. The organ introduction began, a soft, reverent wash of sound designed to soothe and elevate. It was a beautiful arrangement, but one that demanded subtlety. Eleanor's ultimate demand. I drew a breath, tasting the dry, stale air of the ancient church, and began to sing. I started exactly as instructed, my voice small, contained, and perfectly modulated. I kept the volume minimal, focusing on the purity of the tone rather than its power. It was technically flawless, but emotionally sterile. I could feel the music dying in my throat, a caged bird beating its wings against brass bars. Modest, quiet, respectable. Eleanor's mantra echoed in the hollow space behind my eyes. But as the melody progressed into the second verse, something shifted. The music itself began to demand more. The notes climbed higher, the harmonic structure swelling beneath me. My Navy training, the secret rehearsals I'd held late at night, whispered to me of breath control and resonance. My body instinctively recognized the architecture of the piece, the moments where the line was meant to soar, to touch the vaulted ceiling. I fought the urge, holding back, trying to keep the sound locked inside the safe, small box Eleanor had built for me. But then, as the chorus approached, a glorious, ascending line praising resurrection and light, my resolve broke. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a physical necessity. My lungs demanded the full volume they were capable of. I let go. For 3 glorious seconds, I allowed my voice to fill the space. It wasn't the full, raw operatic power I usually reserved for my private practice, but it was powerful enough. It was clean, clear, and utterly resonant, bouncing off the dark oak beams and the stained glass windows. I felt the sound vibrating in my chest, a physical release of tension and suppressed energy. It was the voice of me, the singer Eleanor had tried so desperately to excise. The moment was fleeting. As quickly as I had unleashed it, I pulled back, abruptly finishing the phrase with the required humility, my volume dropping back to a demure whisper for the final notes. I finished the piece feeling lightheaded, a strange mixture of triumph and dread swirling in my gut. I knew I had crossed a line. The conductor offered a small, appreciative smile and lowered his baton. Silence descended, heavy and expectant. Then a few scattered claps began, quickly picked up by the rest of the congregation. It wasn't a roaring ovation. This was New England society, after all, where emotion was generally considered vulgar. But it was warm, and it was genuine. It was more than polite obligation. I saw several heads nodding, their expressions shifting from detached observation to mild approval. Old Mrs. van der Waals, matriarch of the most important family in town, leaned forward slightly and gave a single, distinct nod of her head. It was a small victory, a flash of recognition that affirmed the power of my true voice, even when constrained. But the victory felt brittle, like thin glass. I knew the real judgment was waiting for me. The recessional began, and I stepped down from the platform, my legs feeling unsteady. I tried to merge back into the choir, but Eleanor's gravity pulled me toward her. She intercepted me near the heavy oak doors leading out of the sanctuary, where we paused to receive the formal congratulations of Father's business associates and the church committee. Her smile was fixed, a wide, practiced mask of graciousness reserved for public display. "Wonderful, Eleanor," someone murmured. "Such a moving service." "Thank you, George," she replied smoothly, her smile never wavering. But as she spoke, her fingers clamped down on my left arm just above the elbow. Her grip was immediate and crushing, a vice of bone and muscle digging into my soft skin. I felt a sharp, burning pain, and I knew instantly that I was in trouble. She maintained that grip as we navigated the throng of departing parishioners, her public self radiating perfection while her private self delivered the punishment. We finally reached the edge of the crowd, sheltered momentarily by a massive stone pillar near the portico. Her eyes, usually cold, were burning with a frightening intensity. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a surgical hiss, perfectly modulated so that no one nearby could possibly hear the malice beneath the honeyed tone. "You looked like a parlor maid trying to imitate a professional," she articulated, each word a tiny, poisoned needle. Her breath smelled faintly of expensive mints and pure, unadulterated fury. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? That vulgar display of volume? You utterly embarrassed this family in front of the Vanderwalls. They came to see refinement, Sarah, not a street performance." The pain in my arm was nothing compared to the shock of her words. A parlor maid. That was the ultimate degradation, stripping me not just of talent, but of status, reducing me to an inconsequential servant reaching above her station. "I told you to maintain reverence," she continued, her voice gaining a dangerous edge. "You lacked quiet dignity. Never again will you disgrace us with that inappropriate display. You will apologize to your father for making him look foolish." I couldn't speak. The air seemed to have been sucked from my lungs. I felt utterly hollowed out, the brief triumph of my soaring note dissolving into ash. I realized then, with terrifying clarity, that nothing I ever did, no achievement, no display of talent, no adherence to her rules, would ever be good enough for her. My existence was a perpetual flaw in her perfect tapestry. She finally released my arm, leaving a throbbing ache and the promise of deep bruises. She straightened her expensive coat and swept off toward father, her gracious mask instantly back in place. I stood there, frozen, watching her glide away, the embodiment of refined cruelty. The walk home was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Father, as usual, was oblivious, talking on his phone about a pending merger. Eleanor walked slightly ahead, refusing to look at me, treating the pavement I trod upon as if it were contaminated. The only sound was the clicking of her expensive heels on the sidewalk, a rhythmic, unforgiving beat of judgment. The insult echoed louder than any choir could have sung. Parlor maid. When we finally reached the silent, imposing manor, I went straight to my room, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I didn't bother to change out of the drab, shapeless gown she had forced me into. I went immediately to the loose floorboard beneath the old mahogany dresser. My hands trembled slightly as I pried it up. Inside, beneath a stack of old sheet music, lay the crisp, official envelope, the acceptance letter from the U.S. Navy School of Music. I pulled it out and reread the opening paragraph, the one stating that my audition demonstrated exceptional vocal range and superior control, ideally suited for high-level military performance. The Navy didn't see a parlor maid. They saw potential. They saw power. They saw something worth training, worth elevating, worth putting on a national stage. I sat on the edge of my bed, the letter a cool, solid promise in my hands. The crushing insult from the church porch finally solidified my resolve. I had been planning to leave, yes, but I had been terrified of the execution, worried about the confrontation, worried about disappointing father. Now, all that worry was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I was leaving, and I wasn't just going to slip away quietly, allowing Eleanor to spin a tale of my failure or moral lapse. I was going to leave with purpose, with noise, and with undeniable success. I needed to finalize the acceptance. I needed to act now. I retrieved my writing desk, pulled out a sheet of fine stationery, the kind Eleanor approved of, ironically, and composed my acceptance reply to the Navy School of Music. My hand was steady as I wrote the words confirming my enrollment and my requested arrival date. I knew the timing had to be perfect. Eleanor's grand fundraiser brunch, scheduled for 2 weeks from this Sunday, was her crowning social event of the year. It was designed to solidify her standing, to impress the Vanderwalls, and to remind everyone of her flawless control over her household and her husband's reputation. That event, I decided, would be the stage for my liberation. I folded the acceptance letter and sealed the envelope, pressing the wax coolly under my thumb. 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks until I was gone forever, and she would finally realize that the disgrace she tried so hard to hide was actually the one thing that would make me famous, and the one thing that would publicly expose her cruelty. I hid the sealed letter beneath my mattress, feeling a profound sense of calm settle over me. The parlor maid was about to enlist, and the military doesn't whisper. The 2 weeks that followed the Easter service stretched before me like a tightrope walk over an abyss. I had made my decision, sealed it with wax, and now I had to live the lie until the moment of truth. My life became an exercise in camouflage. I moved through the grand, echoing halls of the manor like a ghost, perfecting the art of appearing demure and thoroughly defeated, giving Eleanor no reason, no single slip of the tongue or errant glance, to suspect the rebellion brewing beneath my placid surface. Every morning, I woke to the oppressive silence she had mandated, but now, the silence was my ally. It masked the frantic hammering of my heart and the meticulous planning unfolding in my mind. I began the slow, painful process of divestment. I didn't have many possessions of true value. Eleanor had ensured that. My meager allowance was spent on books and sheet music, not jewelry or fashionable clothes. But I found a few small items: a delicate silver locket my mother had given me, a slightly used cashmere scarf that had been a gift from a distant aunt, and a small antique music box. I sold them quietly, using a classified ad and meeting the buyers in a neutral public spot far from the manor. I needed cash, enough for the small essentials the Navy wouldn't provide immediately, and enough to ensure I could survive if anything went wrong with the intricate plan. The duffel bag was the hardest part. It was a standard, sturdy canvas bag I'd bought at a surplus store under the guise of needing it for charity donations. I packed only what was essential: my favorite scores, a change of clothes, and the heavy black boots I knew I would need soon. I hid the bag deep in the recess of my closet, tucked beneath a pile of antiquated winter blankets that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. Every time I opened that closet, I felt a jolt of nervous energy, knowing that the key to my future was hidden right there, inches from the expensive, shapeless gowns Eleanor insisted I wear. While I was meticulously planning my escape, Eleanor was consumed by her own, equally meticulous preparations for the annual spring fundraiser brunch. This event wasn't just a party, it was her coronation. It was the moment she solidified her standing among the elite of New England society, positioning herself as the undisputed patroness of the arts and the church committee. The manor became a hive of frenetic, nervous energy. The scent of expensive lilies and imported beeswax polish hung heavy in the air. The phone rang incessantly, caterers confirming the imported salmon, florists debating the precise shade of the tablecloths, and society editors promising glowing coverage. I watched her glide through the chaos, radiant and imperious, barking orders at the household staff, her voice sharp and brittle. She measured her success by the names on the guest list. Every mention of the van der Waals, the formidable matriarch of the town's oldest money, caused a flicker of pure, unadulterated vanity in Eleanor's cold eyes. This brunch was designed to impress Mrs. van der Waals, to secure Eleanor's place forever at the pinnacle of their social hierarchy. It was during this time that I truly understood the depth of her obsession with control. She wasn't just concerned with appearances. She was constructing a fragile reality based entirely on status and exclusion. And I, with my uncouth voice and my inconvenient passion, was a threat to that reality. The greatest risk lay in the secret communication. I couldn't use the manor phone. Eleanor tracked every incoming and outgoing call. So 2 days after sealing my acceptance letter, I drove the old family station wagon, a relic she rarely used, far out of town, ostensibly to run an errand for the housekeeper. I found a public phone booth next to a dusty gas station, the glass grimy, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and exhaust. It felt a million miles away from the crystal and silver of our dining room. I dropped in the coins, my hand shaking slightly, and dialed the number for the U.S. Navy School of Music recruitment office. A stern, professional voice answered. Lieutenant Commander Harris speaking. I swallowed, forcing my voice to sound calm and decisive, not the timid whisper Eleanor had trained me for. Lieutenant Commander, this is Sarah, my name. I received my acceptance letter, and I need to confirm my arrival date. And I need to request a specific method of transportation. I could hear the scratch of a pen on the other end. Miss my name? That's wonderful news. We usually coordinate travel via standard commercial routes. When are you planning to arrive? I need to arrive on the morning of the 14th, I stated firmly, naming the exact date of Eleanor's fundraiser brunch. And I need your personnel to arrange pickup at my residence. There was a moment of silence, a long, heavy silence that stretched the line taut. Miss my name, we don't typically do house calls. Is there a reason you can't meet a transport at the local depot? This is a military operation, not a taxi service. My heart pounded against my ribs. I knew this was the moment I had to be brutally honest, without sounding hysterical. Lieutenant Commander, I said, leaning close to the speaker, lowering my voice even further. I am currently living under circumstances where any attempt to leave quietly will be physically and socially intercepted by my guardian. She believes my place is in a finishing school, not the armed forces. She has publicly humiliated me to destroy my confidence. She is also extremely well connected in this community. If I leave without official, undeniable military presence, she will ruin my reputation and potentially obstruct my enrollment. I took a breath. The reason I scored so highly on the vocal assessment is that I have a gift that she has tried to aggressively suppress. If you want the voice you heard on the tape, you must extract it formally. I need a public declaration of my service, Lieutenant. Commander, I need the choir. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. Less confused, more considering. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Harris chuckled, a low, dry sound. Well, miss my name, that is certainly an unusual request. We don't generally treat recruitment like a hostage negotiation. However, your score was, frankly, extraordinary. You are a highly sought-after asset. Let me see what I can arrange. Give me the address and the time. We can certainly make an official appearance to honor a recruit of your caliber. Consider it an induction ceremony. I dictated the manor address and the precise time, 11:30 a.m., right after the main course of the brunch was served, when Eleanor would be giving her self-congratulatory toast. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling not from fear, but from the immense, terrifying power I had just wielded. The military was coming for me. With the escape logistics locked down, I had one final, agonizing task: confronting my father. I knew it was likely futile, but a small, stubborn part of me still craved his acknowledgement, his intervention. I waited until Eleanor was at a committee meeting finalizing the seating chart, a task that would occupy her for hours. I found him in his study, surrounded by the familiar scent of rich leather, old paper, and a faint hint of scotch. He was hunched over a stack of legal briefs, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. "Father?" I asked softly, stepping into the room. He didn't look up immediately. "Yes, Sarah? Can this wait? I have the Blackstone merger briefs to review." "It's about my future," I insisted, walking closer until I stood beside his heavy mahogany desk. He sighed, placing his pen down with a sound of weary resignation, but his eyes were still focused somewhere beyond me, on the dense legal jargon. "Your future is fine, dear. Your mother, Eleanor, has everything arranged. You'll finish your social season, perhaps take a few classes at the community college to look busy, and then we'll start vetting suitable young men. I trust her judgment in these matters." I felt the familiar, crushing weight of his distraction. I tried to push through the fog. But what if I don't want that future? What if I want to use my voice, my real voice? I watched his face for a sign of recognition, a spark of the man who used to read to me when I was small. He merely smiled faintly, a practiced, distant smile. "You are an emotional girl, Sarah. Eleanor is right. You need structure. You need grounding. This talk of real voices is romantic nonsense. You need to focus on stability, a respectable husband, a comfortable life. Don't worry, Eleanor will ensure you find the perfect path. He reached out, patted my hand once, a brief, impersonal touch, and then immediately picked up his pen, signaling the end of the conversation. In that moment, the last thin cord of filial duty, the hope that he might somehow see the truth, snapped entirely. He wasn't malicious like Eleanor. He was simply absent. He had outsourced his role as a father, choosing comfort and convenience over confrontation. I left his study without another word. The cold, hard resolve in my chest solidified into an unyielding certainty. My father would never save me. I had to save myself. And if he couldn't see me in private, he would be forced to see me in public. The magnitude of my plan settled upon me. It wasn't just an escape. It was a necessary public declaration of war against the suffocating expectations of my family and this town. A quiet departure would allow Eleanor to control the narrative, to spin a tale of my shameful flight or erratic behavior. But a public spectacle, witnessed by the very society she coveted, would force her to confront the absolute truth. She had driven me away, and the world saw value where she had only seen embarrassment. I spent the final night before the brunch in a strange state of suspended animation. I didn't sleep much. I simply watched the moon trace patterns on my bedroom floor, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of early morning preparations downstairs. The morning of the fundraiser arrived, humid and bright. The manor was a whirlwind of activity, buzzing with nervous energy and the heavy fragrance of lilies. Servants hurried past, silver gleamed, and the muffled sound of expensive cars arriving began to filter up the stairs. I put on the most unremarkable outfit I owned, a dark, shapeless skirt and a pale blouse that made me blend perfectly into the background of a wealthy household. I looked like a quiet secretary or a particularly well-dressed parlor maid. I watched Eleanor greet the first guests, radiant and terrible, dressed in a custom-made suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile wide and predatory. She was the supreme hostess, the queen of this domain. A strange, absolute calm settled over me. I felt detached, observing the scene as if it were a play I was about to walk out of forever. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt, feeling the sharp, rectangular outline of the small object I had slipped into my pocket after dressing. It was the Navy acceptance pin, a discreet, heavy piece of metal that felt like a talisman of my freedom. I let my fingers trace its edges, a silent promise to myself. She thinks she is the supreme hostess of this day, I thought, my gaze steady as I watched her usher the Van der Waals into the sun-drenched conservatory. But today, I am the main event, and the show starts at 11:30. The morning of the fundraiser brunch dawned with a deceptive, polished calm. I moved through the grand manor like a ghost, an unremarkable shadow in a house built for spectacle. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and roasting duck, a heavy perfume of affluence that always felt suffocating to me. The sunlight, filtered through the immaculate conservatory glass, cast dazzling, sharp reflections off the vast array of crystal and silver laid out on the long mahogany tables. This was Eleanor's domain, her kingdom of polished perfection. Every napkin folded into an architectural wonder, every chair precisely angled, every detail screaming of unassailable societal position. I wore the most neutral dress I owned, a pale beige shift that allowed me to disappear against the creamy walls, serving my final, silent penance as the family's invisible appendage. The guests began to arrive promptly at 11. They were a parade of New England elite, attorneys, bankers, old money matriarchs draped in jewels, and the omnipresent, all-important Van der Waals. Mr. Van der Waals, a man whose opinion Eleanor valued above the actual word of God, arrived with his wife, both radiating a kind of casual, inherited authority. I watched Eleanor glide toward them, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves, her smile a masterpiece of controlled warmth. I positioned myself near the periphery of the conservatory, ostensibly assisting a server, but truly just observing the performance of my stepmother. She was magnificent in her element, accepting compliments on the floral arrangements, discussing the church's new stained glass window project, and subtly reminding everyone of her own tireless efforts. She looked triumphant, untouchable. This event was her crowning glory, designed to solidify her status as the supreme arbiter of taste and philanthropy in this affluent corner of the state. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a sound I prayed was drowned out by the polite, high-pitched chatter. I kept my hand subtly near the pocket where the Navy acceptance pin rested, its sharp edges a constant grounding reminder of the reality I was about to step into. I felt a surge of nervous adrenaline, watching the clock tick past 11:15 a.m. The coordination had been terrifyingly precise, relying on a public phone booth and hushed, almost conspiratorial tones with a chief petty officer miles away. At 11:25 a.m., the servers began distributing the champagne flutes. The room quieted slightly in anticipation of the official toast. Eleanor, radiant in a sapphire blue gown that matched her eyes, took center stage. She tapped her flute lightly, the crystal chime ringing through the conservatory. "If I may have your attention, please," she announced, her voice perfectly modulated, loud enough to command, soft enough to imply graciousness. I watched her raise her glass, her eyes sweeping the room, pausing meaningfully on Mrs. van der Waals. She began her prepared remarks, a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech about the importance of community, tradition, and, implicitly, the importance of her own stewardship. She spoke of the church fund, the necessity of maintaining standards, and the value of proper decorum in all things. She was basking in the collective adoration, drinking in the approval she craved. The moment stretched, taut and shimmering like the surface of the champagne. She was reaching the climax of her oration, her smile fixed, her posture impeccable. I felt a deep, cold satisfaction knowing that this was the peak. Her triumph was now total, and the fall would be absolute. "And so I raise a glass," Eleanor concluded, her voice swelling with faux humility, "to the preservation of the values that make this community so exceptional, and to a future of continued grace and dignity." She paused, ready to sip the sweet nectar of society's approval. And then the sound came. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was a loud, heavy, violent creak. The sound of the massive, century-old oak doors to the main foyer being pushed open with unnecessary, professional force. The effect was instantaneous and total. The polite babble died instantly, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Every head in the conservatory swiveled toward the foyer. Eleanor, her glass halfway to her lips, froze, her perfect smile fracturing into an expression of intense, proprietary irritation at the interruption. I saw them. They were a wall of dark blue, utterly out of place amidst the lilies and pastel silks. Two senior Navy officers led the way, their uniforms pressed to razor sharpness, their faces serious and unsmiling. Behind them marched a contingent of 12 men, the U.S. Navy Blue Jackets Choir. Their presence was dominating, their polished shoes clicking sharply on the imported marble floor, a rhythmic sound that cut through the rarefied silence. They did not hesitate. They did not apologize for their intrusion. The lead officer, a chief petty officer whose demeanor suggested absolute, unquestionable authority, marched directly through the crowded space, bypassing the polite circles and heading straight toward Eleanor. I felt a dizzying mix of terror and elation. This was it. The plan was in motion, and it was even more dramatic than I had dared hope. The chief petty officer stopped a few feet from Eleanor, who was now gripping her champagne flute so hard her knuckles were white. Her eyes were flashing with dangerous confusion. "I apologize for the intrusion, madam," the officer stated, his voice clear, deep, and perfectly audible, carrying effortlessly across the stunned room. It was a voice used to giving commands, not asking permission. "But we are operating under official orders." A collective gasp swept through the guests. Official orders? At a Sunday brunch? The idea was preposterous, yet the presence of the uniforms made it undeniable. Eleanor found her voice, though it was tight and strained. "Orders? I'm afraid I don't understand. This is a private residence, and we are hosting a charitable event. The officer gave a curt, formal nod. Understood, madam. However, our mission is time-sensitive. We are here to honor and officially process the immediate departure of our newest, most promising recruit for the U.S. Navy School of Music. The room erupted in a low murmur of confusion. Recruit? Music? People looked around, searching for a young man who might be leaving for basic training. Eleanor's face was now a mask of pure annoyance, clearly ready to dismiss the entire spectacle as a vulgar military blunder. The chief petty officer ignored her, his eyes scanning the crowd. I stood perfectly still, trying to melt into the wall, but knowing my time for invisibility was over. I could feel Eleanor's impatient glare directed at the officer, demanding he conclude his tasteless interruption. This recruit, the officer continued, raising his voice slightly, ensuring every society ear heard the words, has demonstrated a vocal talent that the Navy assesses as being of national importance. We are here to celebrate her acceptance and secure her passage. Then, the moment of absolute, irreversible truth arrived. The officer turned slightly, his gaze sweeping past the bewildered guests, past my father who was watching from the edge of the dining room with a look of utter bewilderment, and settled directly on me. He spoke my name. It wasn't whispered or dismissed or framed by Eleanor's condescension. It was stated clearly, professionally, and with immense respect. Miss Sarah, my name. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the faint, distant sound of traffic outside the manor gates. I saw Eleanor's face crumple. It wasn't anger yet. It was the dawning horror of public defeat. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the pale, brittle white of old porcelain. Her glass slipped slightly in her hand, the champagne threatening to spill onto the Persian rug. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The disgrace she had tried to silence, the voice she had called uncouth, was not only leaving, but was being validated and celebrated on the very stage she had built for her own glory. I saw the malice flicker in her eyes, quickly followed by the profound, crushing defeat of knowing that the entire affluent audience, the Van der Waals, the church committee, her rivals, were witnessing her utter lack of control and her malicious misjudgment. The chief petty officer gave me a slight, encouraging nod. He then turned back to the room, a dramatic flourish of his hand signaling the choir. "Gentlemen," he commanded, "the anthem." I braced myself, not for the music, but for the sound of liberation. The chief petty officer turned slightly, his eyes searching the crowd, and then he spoke my name. Miss Sarah, my name. I saw Eleanor's face crumple instantly, the color draining away as the reality hit her. She knows, I realized. She knows I beat her. The officer signaled the choir, and I braced myself for the sound of liberation. Chapter 5. The Anthem of Liberation. The silence that followed the chief petty officer's declaration was thick, heavy, and absolute, far more potent than any carefully constructed hush Eleanor had ever demanded. Then, the silence shattered. The sound that erupted from the 12 men of the Navy Blue Jackets choir was not merely music. It was a physical force. They launched into the final movement of the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." But it was a rendition I had never heard in the hushed confines of our downtown church. It was arranged for full, robust power, the bass voices resonating deep in my chest, shaking the very crystal on the linen-draped tables. This was the voice Eleanor had called uncouth. This was the power she had insisted must be muted, whispered, and drained of all life. Yet here it was, magnified by the acoustic mastery of trained professionals, filling every corner of the grand manor she had worked so hard to control. The soaring tenors didn't just reach the vaulted ceiling, they seemed to push through it, a triumphant declaration echoing across the manicured lawns. I stood rooted to the spot, feeling the music wash over me, cleansing the residue of weeks of forced restraint. I watched the faces of the assembled elite. The initial shock had morphed into something akin to awe. Mrs. van der Waals, who had perfected the art of polite boredom, had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with unfeigned astonishment. The church elders, usually stiff and judgmental, leaned forward, captivated by the sheer, undeniable talent before them. This wasn't merely a performance, it was an event, a magnificent, unexpected rupture in the carefully curated fabric of their society. The choir was singing for me, but in a deeper sense, they were singing my voice, the one I had been forced to hide. Every note was a rebuttal to Eleanor's cruelty, every crescendo a triumphant shout against the years of suppression. As the hymn reached its powerful final chord, the sound hung in the air, vibrating like a plucked string, before dissolving into a profound, almost reverent silence. The chief petty officer, a man named Henderson, waited precisely 3 beats before stepping forward again. He carried himself with the authority of the uniform, an authority that eclipsed any social standing in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice clear and projecting without needing to shout, "the United States Navy School of Music is here today on official duty. We are honoring our newest recruit, Miss Sarah, my name, who has demonstrated not only extraordinary dedication, but a truly exceptional vocal range." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. I could feel every eye in the room shift from the CPO to me. I stood taller, consciously shedding the slouch Eleanor had ingrained in me. Miss My Name tested at the highest possible vocal level in her recent evaluation, Henderson continued, a proud smile breaking his professional composure. And due to the unique power and clarity of her voice, she has been personally selected for a distinct honor. She will perform the national anthem at the upcoming commissioning ceremony of the newest Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, the USS Guardian. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room, followed immediately by a deafening wave of applause. This wasn't the polite, measured clapping following the Easter service. This was genuine, thunderous adulation. The magnitude of the announcement was instantly understood by everyone present. Performing at a carrier commissioning was not a local church event. It was a nationally televised historical moment. I was no longer Eleanor's embarrassing stepdaughter. I was a representative of the country, a national asset. In the midst of the roaring appreciation, my gaze snapped to Eleanor. Her collapse was total. She had been standing next to the massive antique mahogany sideboard, holding the half-raised champagne flute. When Henderson spoke of the aircraft carrier commissioning, the flute slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the polished wood floor with a sharp, brittle crack. The sound was surprisingly small against the applause, but for me, it was the sound of her world breaking. Her face was a study in profound public exposure. The color had completely drained, leaving her skin a ghastly, translucent white. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide and unfocused, fixed on me with a mixture of pure malice and absolute defeat. She was witnessing the total failure of her life's work, to suppress and control me, and to maintain her flawless image among her peers. She was publicly exposed as a petty, malicious suppressor of national talent, caught red-handed in her vanity. All the years of carefully constructed social standing, the endless luncheons, the charity committees, the perfectly planned brunches, were dissolving into this single, crushing moment of humiliation. I felt no pity, only a cold, hard satisfaction. Then I saw him, my father. He had been standing near the back, obscured by a cluster of attorneys, likely discussing some merger or acquisition. He pushed through the crowd, his tie slightly askew, his face a complex roadmap of shock, confusion, and something I hadn't seen directed at me since my mother died. Overwhelming, genuine pride. He reached me first, his hand gripping my shoulder with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and disbelief. "The Navy? The aircraft carrier?" I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I saw him. Not the busy attorney influenced by Eleanor's narratives, but the man who had loved my mother and encouraged my singing when I was a child. He finally saw me, not as the burden Eleanor had painted, but as a success entirely my own. "I'm leaving today, Dad," I said quietly, the resolve firm in my voice. I accepted their offer weeks ago. He didn't try to stop me. He simply nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Go, Sarah. Go and sing." With his blessing, the last cord of filial duty snapped completely, replaced by a liberating sense of self-ownership. I turned to face the room. The applause had died down, replaced by a steady stream of murmurs and approaches. Mrs. van der Waals was the first to reach me, her expression now one of intense, delighted interest. "My dear Sarah, this is simply magnificent," she exclaimed, grasping my hands firmly. "To think, a voice like yours, we must have you sing at the benefit gala next season, though I suppose the Navy has first claim now." I accepted her congratulations with a calm, professional smile. I was no longer the awkward girl in the shapeless dress. I was the talented recruit, the upcoming national performer. The church committee members, who had previously ignored me, now vied for my attention, offering effusive praise and telling me how they had always known I had a special gift. I had shed the invisible cloak of the family embarrassment and stepped into the dazzling light of public validation. The chief petty officer approached me, holding out a crisp, neatly folded navy jacket. It was dark blue wool, sharp and imposing. "If you'd care to join us, Miss My Name," he offered, his eyes twinkling. "We have a transport waiting. We need to get you processed and on your way to boot camp." I took the jacket, the rough, clean wool feeling heavy and reassuring in my hands. I slipped it on. It was oversized, but the material felt like armor. I looked across the room, past the admiring faces and the shattered champagne glass, to Eleanor. She was still standing by the sideboard, utterly motionless, a monument to her own spectacular failure. I met her eyes one final time. I offered no words, no gesture of final defiance. The choir's performance, the CPO's announcement, and the sheer volume of public admiration had said everything that needed to be said. My silence was the final crushing blow. It confirmed my victory and her ruin. I turned my back on the manor, accepting the CPO's steady arm. As we made our way back toward the heavy oak doors, the Blue Jackets choir fell into formation behind us, their footsteps a disciplined, rhythmic cadence. I walked out of that suffocating house not in disgrace, not sneaking away in the dead of night, but escorted by the uniform and the talent of my country, heading toward my new life. We stepped outside into the bright, late morning sun. The Navy transport vehicle, a large, dark sedan, was waiting at the end of the circular drive. I climbed into the back seat, the leather cool and smooth beneath me. I watched the grand manor disappear in the rearview mirror as the driver pulled smoothly away from the curb. The mansion, with its suffocating elegance and its oppressive silence, shrank quickly until it was just a smudge of white stone and dark oak. I settled back, running my fingers over the crisp collar of the navy jacket. I realized I was finally, irrevocably free. They told me my voice was too loud, too large, too much for a respectable woman. They tried to silence me, to turn me into a demure, obedient shadow. Now, that same voice belonged to the sea, to the country, and to my own destiny. It was a voice that would no longer whisper in the gilded cages of New England society, but would soar over the flight deck of a warship, shaking the world.